Good morning. It's Tuesday after Sunday, and someone forgot to push the button on the camera, and so we didn't have the live recording, and I'm so sorry if you tuned in and didn't see it. So instead, we're going to record today, and I'd love to share my sermon with you, and Carol will share some music with you, and we hope that you are drawn closer to God through this. In the name of God, who created us from love, God who came to us in love, and God who sustains and inspires us with love. Amen. So imagine you're there with Moses. You can hear the Pharaoh's army coming after you. You see the deep water in front of you. God tells Moses to raise his shepherd's crook up over the water and to tell it to part. And Moses raises his crook. Do you trust God enough to take that first step? The army coming for you will surely kill you. The first step may mean freedom and it may mean death. Do you trust God? We have lots of incidents of people taking first steps. Look at the firefighters in California. A great day for surfing. But they're taking first steps into the inferno that is engulfing the West Coast. 19 years ago, what made the first responders take the first steps into the remnants of the Twin Towers? Behind them, a crisp, gorgeous fall day. In front of them, smoke, ash, dust, and the cries of other human beings. What makes people take the first step down the aisle? Parents, friends behind them, and the love of their life waiting for them at the end of the journey. Few of us remember our first steps. Think of the first upright step on 2 feet, crawling babyhood behind us, the whole world in front of us. Do we trust God enough to take the first step? Presently, do we trust God enough to take the first step to eradicate systemic racism? Do we trust God enough to take the first step to lead asylum seekers across our southern border? Do we trust God enough to take the first step to vote this November? During this pandemic, do we trust God enough to take the first step to calm the fears of our own and of our friends? Every year, Christians and Jews tell the story of freedom and resurrection and new life. Our ancestors left Egypt a teeming multitude, a ragtag crowd of former slaves in a great hurry for a long-awaited deliverance. They made their way toward freedom only to find the great sea blocking their path. Do we trust God enough to take the first step? And God said to Moses, lift up your hands and the sea will split. And Moses held his arm out over the sea, and God drove back the sea with a mighty wind all night. The waters split, and the children of Israel walked in the midst of the sea on dry ground, waters forming a translucent wall on either side. That's the Torah's version of events, the one that people read at Passover and Seder tables, the ones that we tell on Holy Easter Saturday. A spectacle, a miracle to be sure, but there's something totally passive about it, accomplished through Moses' hands and God's grace, but missing the element of human agency. So in their boldness, the rabbis told a new story. In their version, detailed in the Babylonian Talmud, the Israelites gathered at the water's edge, and Moses lifted his hands as God commanded, and nothing happened. The sea remained still. Can you imagine the panic of the people at that moment? Moses had never failed to produce a miracle before. Murmuring ran through the crowd, and many considered turning back and allowing themselves to be enslaved once more. Then, out of the crowd, walked a solitary figure, Nathan, the son of Amminadab, stepped into the water. His family and friends looked in horror and amazement. They cried out, "What are you doing? Where do you think you're going?" Nathan walked forward like a man possessed. First the water came up to his knees, and then to his waist, and then to his chest. The second the water came up over his nostrils and fully submerged him, at that moment and not a second before, the water divided. It split in two, and the people behind him were able to walk behind Nathan to liberation, to a place of singing and joy. Our rabbis read and priests read this story into the Torah to teach us that liberation comes only to the courageous. Nathan's gift was the ability not only to see the possibility of the moment, but to believe in it strongly enough to be willing to risk wading into the water. We are a people who call ourselves by many names. Sometimes we are children of Abraham. Often we're the children of Jacob, who wrestled with an angel. I've come to believe that another good name for us would be, we are the descendants of Nathan, of the ones who willingly walked into the sea, propelled by a belief that life could be better for themselves and their children. These are not just our spiritual ancestors, but our literal ancestors. A century ago, it was grandparents and great-grandparents who made the rocky ocean crossings and leaky steerage with a dream about the life that they could build for future generations. In more modern times, it was waves of migrants from North Africa, from Iran, from Russia, who set out to escape tyranny. Most recently, these weary ones fleeing gangs and military kidnapping and murder, these have walked 3 months in the desert, no water to part, but barely a drop to drink. They are seeking asylum, a chance for a new life, a chance at freedom. These men and women lived the faith of Nathan. They split the sea for us so that we could walk on dry ground. A piece of our hearts owe them a constant measure of gratitude. But just because most of us no longer need to cross an ocean does not mean we don't bear the responsibility with being a child of Nathan. In each and every generation, we are called upon to step into the breach, to carve a path for future generations, whether through activism or research or art. We are summoned to live in such a way that someday others will look back on us and say, because they were brave, there was space for us to walk behind. Of course, there is a final thing. When Nathan and his people get to this other side of the sea, what is there to greet them? Not a promised land, but a wide, wild desert that will take years to navigate. Just because the sea splits doesn't mean that we know exactly where we're going or how we're going to get there. But we do know this: the first steps are the hardest ones and the most necessary. With God's blessed assurance, with Nathan's first steps, the story really begins. Amen.
Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a This is